Welcome back to the channel, where we share real stories that will make you think twice before stepping into familiar places. Today, we're diving into one of the most common environments, movie theaters. You might think they're just places to relax and enjoy a film, but what many don't realize is that sometimes, these locations hide disturbing secrets. Stories that unfold right next to you, but you only notice when it's too late. Get ready for a chill down your spine, because what you're about to hear is not fiction. These are real, terrifying experiences, and they can happen to anyone. The silent audience. I used to work at a small, old cinema in a quiet town. It wasn't one of those large, modern theaters, it was more of a relic from the past. The walls were faded, the chairs creaked, and the projector occasionally gave off that familiar clicking sound. It had this nostalgic charm, but after what I experienced, I've never looked at cinemas the same way again. One night, I was scheduled for a late shift. The final showing was a low-budget horror film, and as expected, not many people showed up. There were maybe 10, scattered across the vast rows of seats. I had grown used to the eeriness of the near-empty screenings. The silence, the dim lighting, and the sound of the film playing on screen, it created an atmosphere that, over time, had stopped bothering me. That night, though, something felt off right from the start. About halfway through the movie, I noticed one of the attendees. He was sitting alone in the back row, wearing a dark jacket and a hat that shadowed most of his face. I hadn't seen him come in, but that wasn't unusual since I often stayed in the back office until the film began. Still, something about him caught my eye. Maybe it was the way he sat, unnervingly still, or the fact that he seemed completely uninterested in the movie. During my rounds, I went up and down the aisles, checking the few other patrons. Everyone else seemed normal, watching the movie, reacting occasionally. But the man in the back row didn't move. Not even a shift in his seat, not a glance at the screen. It was as if he were frozen. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was tired, or maybe the film just wasn't grabbing his attention. But as I continued my routine checks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After the movie ended, the lights came up, and people started trickling out. I did my usual walkthrough to make sure no one left trash behind and that everything was in order. The man in the back was still sitting there, even though the movie had ended. I approached him, intending to ask if he was all right or if he needed anything. As I got closer, I realized I couldn't hear him breathing. His posture was still rigid, his face hidden by the hat. My heart started pounding. I hesitated, then asked quietly, "Excuse me, sir, the movie's over. Are you okay?" No response. I took a step closer, leaning in slightly to see his face. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed the strange pallor of his skin. It was then that I realized he wasn't breathing at all. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, but he was lifeless. I stumbled back, my mind racing. How could someone have sat there the entire movie, dead, without anyone noticing? Panicked, I rushed to the lobby and called the manager, who immediately called the authorities. They arrived within minutes and cordoned off the area. When the paramedics examined him, they told us he had been dead for hours, long before the movie even started. Yet, there he had been, sitting among the living audience, unnoticed and unmoving. The police never found any identification on him. No wallet, no phone, nothing. It was as if he had simply appeared in the theater. The autopsy revealed that he had died of natural causes, but how he ended up there, and why no one noticed him until the very end, remains a mystery. After that night, I couldn't shake the image of his frozen figure sitting in the back row. Every time I walked into that theater, I found myself glancing at that spot, half expecting to see him again. Eventually, I quit that job. I couldn't stand the eerie silence of the theater anymore, or the creeping fear that I wasn't alone, even when the room was empty. To this day, I can't sit through a movie in a quiet cinema without feeling that chill run down my spine. Sometimes I wonder how many others, like him, have been silently watching, unnoticed among us. The flickering light. A few years ago, I worked as a projectionist at a small, single-screen cinema in the heart of town. The place was old, with history embedded in every creak of the floor and the faded posters lining the walls. The projector room, where I spent most of my shifts, had this old-school charm, a small, dusty space overlooking the theater below. I had always loved the solitude of the job. It gave me time to think and, occasionally, enjoy the films that played on screen. One night, we were showing a classic film, something from the 70s. The audience wasn't big, just a few regulars and a couple of people I didn't recognize. I set up the film, dimmed the lights in the room, and let the projector do its work. Everything seemed fine until about 20 minutes in, when the light in the projector room started flickering. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old buildings have quirks, and flickering lights weren't exactly uncommon. But then the projector itself began to sputter. The film stuttered for a second before continuing smoothly. That's when I noticed something odd on the screen. It was brief, so brief that I wasn't sure if I had actually seen it, but for a split second, there was a flash of a different image. Not part of the film. It was like a single frame had been spliced in, something grainy and distorted. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were playing tricks on me. The movie carried on as normal, and I shrugged it off. But then it happened again. Another flicker. This time, I was certain I saw something, a figure, just standing there in the shadows on the screen. It didn't belong in the film. My heart started racing. I rewound the reel slightly to check if it was a mistake in the film. Nothing. The movie played without any interruptions when I reviewed it. It didn't make sense. As the movie progressed, the flickering light in the projector room became more erratic, and the strange images continued to flash on the screen. The figure I kept seeing, it was always in the same position, standing in the far corner of the frame, just out of focus. No one in the audience seemed to notice, they were all engrossed in the film. But I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. About an hour into the film, I heard something. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from behind me, from the far corner of the projection room. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there, just the old shelves lined with film reels and the faint hum of the projector. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. My stomach dropped. I got up and moved towards the back of the room, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the light switch. As soon as I turned the light on, the tapping stopped. The room was silent. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before deciding to sit back down. But the second I did, the light flickered again, and the projector screen flashed that same shadowy figure. Only this time, it wasn't just on the screen. I could feel something. It's hard to explain, but it felt like the air in the room had changed. Heavier. Colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a presence, something standing behind me. I was too afraid to turn around. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, watching as the figure grew clearer, more defined with every flicker. When the movie finally ended, I rushed to shut everything down. I didn't stay to clean up, didn't check if everything was in order. I just wanted to get out. As I was locking the door to the projector room, I glanced one last time at the theater below. For a second, I thought I saw someone still sitting in the back row, someone who hadn't been there when the movie ended. I blinked, and the seat was empty. After that night, I requested fewer late shifts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been in that projector room with me. And every time the lights flickered, I felt that same cold presence, just out of sight, waiting in the shadows. The last show. I used to manage a small cinema in a quiet town. We mostly showed older films or indie movies that didn't draw large crowds. The building was a bit run down, but it had a certain charm to it, with its vintage posters and creaky wooden floors. It was the kind of place where you could feel the history in the air. However, there was one night I'll never forget, and it changed the way I look at empty theaters. It was a Thursday night, and we were hosting a late screening of an old noir film. Hardly anyone came for these late-night showings, especially midweek. That night was no different, just a few regulars and one or two new faces scattered among the seats. By the time the movie started, I counted only 5 people in the entire theater. About halfway through the film, I went into the back office to do some paperwork. The old CCTV monitors showed the live feed of the theater, the lobby, and the concession stand. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear the muffled sounds of the film echoing through the building, but something about the silence made me uneasy. Glancing at the monitors, I noticed something odd. One of the cameras positioned at the back of the theater showed a 6th person. A man, sitting alone in the far corner of the room, in the shadows. He wasn't there when I checked the tickets earlier. I was sure of it. Thinking I might have missed him when he entered, I shrugged it off and continued my work. But as the film went on, I kept glancing at the monitor. The man didn't move. Not once. Even the other patrons occasionally shifted in their seats, but this figure remained perfectly still. I zoomed in the camera slightly to get a better look, but his face was hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see any features, just the outline of a person sitting there. As the film neared its end, I stepped out of the office to make sure everything was in order. I entered the theater quietly, not wanting to disturb anyone. The screen flickered, casting dim light across the room, and I scanned the seats. I counted 5 people. 5. No 6th man. I froze. I could have sworn he was there, right in the back corner, where I had seen him on the monitor. My heart started racing. I walked down the aisle, glancing back at that empty corner every few steps, feeling a growing sense of dread. When I reached the back, there was nothing, just an empty seat and silence, aside from the sound of the movie playing. I hurried back to the office, trying to shake off the uneasiness. But when I looked at the monitor again, there he was, the man in the corner, sitting perfectly still. I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one in that seat when I was in the theater just moments ago. How could he be there now? The movie ended, and the lights came up. The patrons began to gather their things and slowly make their way out. I kept my eyes glued to the monitor, watching as each person left. One by one, the theater emptied. But the man in the corner remained. I couldn't stay in the office any longer. I had to see for myself. I rushed out into the now empty theater, and when I got to the back row, the seat was empty. I stood there, staring at the spot where I had seen him on the camera. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a glitch, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I heard something. A faint whisper, like someone speaking just below my hearing. It was coming from the back of the theater. My blood ran cold. I stood there, frozen, listening. The whispering grew louder, still unintelligible but unmistakable. I didn't stay to figure out what it was. I locked up the theater as quickly as I could and left. That night, I checked the footage from the CCTV cameras. I watched the recording of the entire movie, scanning each frame carefully. Sure enough, the 6th man appeared on the screen, sitting there the whole time, even though I knew he hadn't been there when I walked through the theater. The next day, I brought it up with one of the older employees. He looked at me with a strange expression and said, "Oh, you've seen him too?" Apparently, others had reported seeing the same figure over the years, always sitting in the back corner during late-night screenings, never moving, never making a sound. No one knew who he was or why he appeared, but everyone who worked there had their own story about the man in the shadows. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching from the corner, waiting for the next late show. That's it for today's story. We hope you're leaving with a bit more caution the next time you visit a movie theater. Remember, not everything that happens around us can be explained, and sometimes the most ordinary places hide the darkest secrets. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, chilling stories. And as always, stay alert, because you never know what could be lurking in the shadows. See you in the next one.